Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Dr. Lara Kubzanski and myself, Vish Vishwanath, co-directors of the Lee Kum-Shung Center for Health and Happiness, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our symposium, Beyond Longevity, Achieving Well-Being in Healthy Aging. It has become a sort of a truism to talk about aging, not just in the US, but all over the world. People are living longer. People are living, thanks to the revolutions in public health and biomedical sciences. But the challenge remains on how to achieve healthy aging, not just the number of years you live. So we organized this symposium with that in mind. Today's program, this was supposed to be a full day program with a morning and afternoon sessions. But because of COVID-19, as everyone else, we had to make some adoptions. So we have divided this program into two parts. And today's program will focus on the social assets that support healthy aging. And we will continue the program on November 10th with a discussion of psychological assets. Over the course of this event, expert speakers will discuss important work on aging from a positive health perspective, including our current understanding of social and environmental factors that are likely to support healthy aging, the roles happiness and positive mental health may play in physical health and longevity, promising interventions and policy approaches, and ideas for a future research agenda. The mission of the Lee Kum-Shung Center for Health and Happiness is to build a rigorous and interdisciplinary science of positive health and well-being, and translate that science to influence practice and policy. We hope to achieve a transformation from deficit-based thinking to an understanding of well-being in a broader sense, with a focus on health assets and resources. Like the World Health Organization, we too, the center understands health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. I will be remiss if I don't thank the Lee family, which has endowed the center. They have been extraordinarily grateful and generous in supporting the activities of center, such as the symposium, workshop, as well as a variety of other activities. For more on the center, you're welcome to go to the website of the center and you'll get a lot more information on this. We would also like to thank the Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies for co-hosting this event with us. We'll begin, just to give you a sense of the agenda, we'll begin with a keynote address from Dr. Sandro Galea, Dean and Robert A. Knox Professor of Boston University School of Public Health. After the keynote, Dr. Gruenewald from Chapman University and our own Dr. Claudia Trudel-Fitzgerald from our center will join Dr. Galea for a panel discussion moderated by the center co-director, Dr. Lara Kubzanski. During the program, if you have any questions for our speakers, please type them into the chat box. We are monitoring the chat box and we will be, and we'll feed them to Laura to lead the discussion. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, a good friend and a colleague, Dean Sandro Galea. For many of you, Dean Galea doesn't need any introduction. He's very well known as a physician, epidemiologist, and author. I can spend the next 90 minutes here talking about Dr. Galea's, Dean Galea's accomplishments. I won't do that. You're here to listen to him. But just a couple of things. He has been, among the many accomplishments, he has been named an epidemiology innovator by the Time magazine and one of the world's most influential scientific minds by Thomson Reuters. He's known for his writing on a range of topics, including epidemiology, well-being, and health. His book, Well, What We Need to Talk About When We Talk About Health, was awarded 2019 Book of the Year Award in Consumer Health by American Journal of Nursing. No doubt many of you are familiar with Dean Galea's work and his invaluable contributions to public health and health education. Dean Galea, it is wonderful to have you here today. Thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Vishwanath and Professor Kubzansky, for inviting me. Thank you, Vish, for the typically generous introduction. I worry very much for the introduction like that. It's all downhill from here. So I'm going to do my best to try to live up to some of it. It's really an honor to be here with you, as I was discussing with Professor Kubzansky in the green room ahead of this. I'm just sorry that we're not doing this in person, because I was really looking forward to meeting your community. I've been admiring what the Institute has been doing since Professor Kubzansky and Vishwanath started it, and I actually think that the mission of the Institute is really inspiring, and it's one that I'm delighted to see it move forward. So with that in mind, let me share my slides so I can orient my... Everybody has those? Yeah, good. Okay. So I was asked to, I was assigned this talk title about health and flourishing across the life course, foundational perspective. So I'm going to do my best to do it justice. But my goal really is to put in your space as you head into the symposium some ideas that I think are important to have in one's discussion space if one is really engaging with this question of what are the foundations of health and flourishing. I think there's many different ways in which one can approach this. And I'm going to give you my perspective, obviously with the intent of, as I said, sort of populating conversation and perhaps to provoke a little bit. So I want to start with what we are trying to achieve. And because I do think that sometimes, if I'm giving a foundational talk, it's important to go back a step and say, what are we trying to achieve? And I really want to just start with definitions. So like, what are we talking about? What are we talking about this? You know, I'm talking about foundations for health and flourishing. So what are we talking about in terms of flourishing? And I did not coordinate my opening two slides with Professor Vishwanath, but you'll see I'm actually repeating something he said, which so far so good. I feel like we're aligned because I'm actually repeating Vish a couple of things that you said. So by flourishing, we're really dealing with people experiencing positive emotions, positive functioning, and positive social functioning, so that people can live within an optimal range of human function. And I like this definition very much. This is from about 20 years ago, where fundamentally it is about humans achieving what they can achieve, humans maximizing their life potential. And I see this definition of flourishing as being pretty consistent with the definition of health, which Vish read out already, which is health is a state of complete physical, mental, social well-being, not just the absence of disease or infirmity. To my mind, what this says is that health is a means to an end. The end is flourishing. The end is that we, each of us, achieve our potential. The end is that we actually live in such a way that we do what we would like to do to maximize our time here on the planet. And health allows us to do that. So I often think I have the privilege of serving as a dean of a school of public health. And I often think of that as, my role is to be the dean of a school of means to an end, but the end fundamentally is flourishing, that we as humans can achieve our potential. So that's step A, what we're trying to achieve. Now, how do we achieve this, which I think is where a foundational perspective comes in? Well, in the public conversation, where there is quite a bit of conversation about well-being and self-care. Vish mentioned my last book, which was called Well, What We Need to Talk About When We Talk About Health. And the reason I'm saying this is because the book's title was Well, I spent sort of 6 months after the book was published very much in this wellness space. And there's an enormous space of the public conversation, but much of that space considers how we can achieve health and well-being and flourishing as individuals. Much of that space in the public conversation is about me and how I can achieve it myself. Much of that space deals with concepts like happiness. This is sort of a distribution, is from a classic paper looking at age distribution of psychological well-being or happiness, which shows that, and this has been replicated in other places, that fundamentally you sort of get happier and happier and happier until you're in your early 50s, and then you get happier and happier thereafter. And I mean, this is sort of empiric observations. There's nothing wrong with this, but if you're at all like me, every time you look at a graph like this, the first question you ask is, wait, where do I sit on the graph? Am I about to get less happy or more happy? And what can I do to change my state of happiness? And of course, this then yields a whole other field in terms of looking at different subsets of this: stress and worry and anger and sadness, and how that changes over time. And the only reason I'm showing you this is because this approach, which is ultimately documenting how we are achieving health, positive well-being, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. I want to be clear. But if taken a certain way, it can lead you into a world where you spend all your time thinking only about how you, the individual, can bring this upon yourself. How fundamentally, what we're trying to achieve with health is with my own spiritual life hacks for my own success and my happiness, and how I can work to move from surviving to thriving. This is important. There is no question. There is a good science and a good robust science about how one can achieve positive psychology and the steps that one can take, and linkages at the individual level between what we do and how we can actually achieve the positive psychology and the space to flourish and to achieve optimal human existence as per the definition. But what I wanted to do from a foundational perspective is to say that none of that can happen unless it's overlaid on a set of foundations that creates the space for this positive human existence. None of it can happen without grounding on a set of life experiences and assets that create the opportunity for you to actually flourish and for you to be able to maximize human existence. And that requires we recognize the ineluctable role that context plays over our life course. Now, to make that case, I thought I would actually start by showing you a cartoon. This is from an Australian cartoon called On a Plate, which I quite like. And the way to read this is there are two panels going sort of down. I'm going to go down and slide after slide. Richard is on the left and Paula is on the right. So is Richard, his parents are doing okay. Is Paula, her parents not so much. Richard's house is warm and dry. His shelves are full of books and his fridge is full of food. Paula's house is full of people and not much else. Is damp and noisy and she keeps getting sick. Richard's parents will do anything for their baby. It's like, good boy. So will Paula's. That's why they're working two jobs. Richard goes to a great school, well-resourced, good kids. Teachers love their job. Paula's school, the class sizes are large. School is underfunded. Her teachers are tired. So maybe we can see why the expectations set for Richard, B+, so dear, we need to get you a tutor, might be slightly different than those set for Paula. B, hey, that's not so bad. And over the year, these little differences add up. Parents paying for university, juggling work with university. They start to add up and build to something bigger. His dad says, I have friends working there. I'll have a word to get you an internship while her dad is sick. Each little difference sneaks by unnoticed. Your loan is approved. Look, I can't help you. Maybe try easy finance. Maybe Richard starts to believe that he deserves to be on top and he did it all by himself. You're Roger's boy, right? I've heard good things about you, keeping my eye on you. Maybe Paula starts to settle, learns to know her place. You've got the job, but I'm watching you, sweetie. And then we get to a party congratulating Richard, where somebody says, what's the secret to your success? And you see Paula is serving canapes at the party. And Richard says, well, less whinging, more hard work, I'd say. I'm sick of people asking for handouts. No one ever handed me anything on a plate. Now, what's the point of this cartoon? There's no question that Richard worked hard. Well, I'm assuming Richard worked hard. Let's give Richard the benefit of the doubt that Richard worked very hard. But every ounce of Richard's working hard is built on a set of life course experiences, some of which he deserved, some of which he did not deserve. Every part of Paula's experiences are set on a set of life course experiences, some of which he earned, some of which he did not earn. And that is true for all of us. So I think if we're thinking from a foundational perspective on health and flourishing, we need to understand that health and flourishing has to happen within a life course context, within a context of the world around us and the experiences that are brought upon us in order for us to understand how we can actually build on those. Now, I started with a cartoon. I could move into theoretical frameworks. This is a very simple theoretical framework about what does life course mean. And the way to think about this is to say this is age. And over time, we accumulate risk, or we accumulate risk or benefits, however you look at it. Prenatal period, infancy, adolescence, adult life, older age. And you accumulate risk, right? At the prenatal stage, there's mother's nutrition, your mother's safety, your fetal growth. In infancy, the food you're fed, whether you're exposed to violence, adolescence, exercise, onset of puberty, adult life, your risk behavior, social isolation in older age. These are all risks or the counter of them. They're protective factors. You can look at it in any way. But I like this very, very simple framework because it simply shows that over the life course, we accumulate the exposures that determine our health and our capacity to flourish. And all of that is nested within nested sets of influences, within nested eco-social forces that ultimately drive our health. So this is a very simple framework that says our health is influenced, of course, by our genes and by what we do, but that's influenced by our individual risks, by our relationships with each other, by where we live, by the institutions, and by the policies and politics within which we live. And I think that's a very simple foundational framework for how we can think about health and flourishing over the life course. We need to recognize that risks and assets accumulate over the life course, and that they ultimately intersect with different levels of influence that one has from the individual extending out to the community, to the country, and to the world. So having set that foundation, now let me make a couple of more particular points, which I think are important to have in the space of a symposium like this in terms of informing other conversations. And actually this preface is something that, again, Professor Vishwanath said, or well, I guess it follows what Professor Vishwanath said, which is when one thinks of this, we often think of mental health, that this is all about mental health, this is all about psychology. And I did just want to label that I don't think that one should or can separate physical and mental health. That fundamentally, the science is evolving, and many people who are on this call have contributed to the science, making it very clear that physical and mental health are inseparable. They are a piece of the same equation. This is from a very straightforward paper, actually, looking at, for example, lifehood traumatic events and subsequent physical conditions. We tend to think of traumatic events as affecting mental health, but this is simply looking at physical conditions. And all I want you to see, this is a busy table. I normally wouldn't show a busy table, but it's a very straightforward message. Arthritis, back pain, heart disease, high blood pressure. All I want you to see is just go across. And all you see is that these odds ratios get bigger as you go across. And that is more traumatic events you experience, the more your risk for different physical conditions. And what I like about this table is it's just so universal. It's just so universal. So whenever we think about things like traumatic event, you think of, okay, well, let's bucket that in the bucket of the mental health people. Well, no, mental health and physical health are inseparable. And this is from a paper from Professor Kubzansky, which I wanted to show, which I really like this paper because it actually shows this very, very simply, that you have over time and you have the accumulation of BMI. And all this paper shows, I mean, it shows many things, but what this graph is showing is that the more number of mental health symptoms you have, it puts you in simply a higher curve of body mass index achievement. So it really takes something that we've talked about a lot in this country, which is the obesity epidemic, and shows that while the obesity epidemic has been following a particular overall trajectory, you can readily stratify that by mental health symptoms and show that if you have trauma and PTSD symptoms, you've had consistently over time greater risk of obesity at every time point. And then one other paper from Harvard group, from Professor Conan's group, is showing how trauma and symptoms again are associated with diabetes. Over age, you have more likely to have diabetes, but if you have more symptoms, your slope of acquiring diabetes over time gets steeper and steeper. So I really just want to show those three slides to make the point again from a foundational perspective that as I'm talking about the life course perspective and an eco-social perspective as being foundational to understanding health as a means to flourishing, we should be thinking about health as mental and physical health together. Now, I want to talk about the particular role of assets and stressors, because increasingly I've come to feel like when we're talking about health and talking about particularly health as a means to people living their full potential, we cannot not realize that underlying our capacity to achieve our potential is this balance between assets and stressors, with one really being the inverse of the other. And that balance is, I think, reflected well in the cartoon where Richard had a number of assets handed to him. Paula did not have those assets. Paula had a lot of stressors that were foisted upon her. Richard did not have those stressors. And those assets and stressors balance, I think, ultimately sets the stage foundationally for health and our capacity to flourish. This is a definition of a traumatic event. A traumatic event is an experience that causes physical, emotional, psychological distress or harm. It threatens our safety and our sense of stability in the world. it is, to my mind, the ultimate stressor. Something becomes a traumatic event. And we can discuss in the Q&A the distinction between stressors and traumas. I tend to think it's a largely an artifactual distinction, but fundamentally, stressors and traumas causes distress and threaten our sense of safety and our place in the world. And we know that traumatic events are associated with poor health, period. And I've shown you some of that in the context of mental health and physical health, but I'm only showing this one from a paper by Professor Pearson, because it's just such a simple, straightforward dose-response relation. More traumatic event, more likely you are to have depression. The reason I'm showing this is because I have found in my conversations around this topic is that we often get boggled by the notion of things like post-traumatic growth and the potential for resilience and emerging stronger. And I think there is a whole set of research on that, which I think is important. But I do not want that to take away from the fundamental, again, I'm talking about the foundations, from the fundamental observation that traumatic events and stressors are decrements to our capacity to have a healthy life and are decrements to our capacity to actually have a positive health and to flourish and to achieve our human potential. Now, I did want to bring that to the current moment because we are living the great American trauma. We are living a moment where we are dealing with a threat to self from the threat of infectious disease, and in economic downturn, the likes of which we have not seen in 100 years, civil unrest that has been unprecedented for about 50 years. Each of those three are in and of themselves great American traumas, and they would have characterized the year if we just had one of those three. We are currently living through them all at the same time. We're currently living through three of them, through three great American traumas. And we are seeing a shift in health, and I could spend a whole time talking about COVID, which I won't here, a shift in health linked to the moment. What I want to show you here, this is from a paper from our group, is looking at people with and without generalized anxiety right now. And what I want to show you here is number of stressors. The only point I want to make is the orange is people without general anxiety, and the green line is people with general anxiety. All I want to show you is this is a very classic shift in the population curve, which is sort of very classic from the foundations of population health. And more stressors that people are experiencing right now, we are shifting the burden of anxiety, mood anxiety disorders, and we are going to be seeing that as shifting health over the next year, 2 years, and decades. So we are in a moment where our stressors are shifting our acid stressor balance, and it's going to influence health and potential for flourishing for decades to come. This is from a paper that we just published recently. I realize my footnote still says under review, but this actually just came out. What this paper showed is that the probability of depression in the current moment is overall in the population about a threefold increase in depression. But importantly, the burden of depression is in this group, is in the group of people with low assets and high stressors. And that group has almost a fourfold increase in depression with people with high assets and low stress. So I don't think that we can think about health and flourishing from a foundational perspective without recognizing that fundamentally the opportunity for health and to flourish emerges from an intersection of assets and stressors, and that combination of assets and stressors accumulates over the life course and accumulates in terms of concentric circles of influence on all of this. And then my last key point before I start winding down is that I also do not think that we can have these conversations without talking about the fact that we live in a very unequal society. I actually don't think we can have this conversation without recognizing that the distribution of health and opportunities for flourishing are mirrored by an underlying foundational maldistribution of assets in our world. And I could show you that in many different ways. You've all heard about the top 1% owning more and more assets, or more and more income, more and more wealth, more and more assets. I actually tend to find the top 1% language not particularly helpful, because I think it's very distancing, because it's like, it's them, it's us versus them. I think more helpful and more useful is us thinking about the top richest 20%, which broadly speaking, by the way, is people with a 4-year college degree, which broadly speaking is everybody in a symposium like this, that our incomes have gone up in the past 50 years, but the incomes of the poorest 80% of the country have not budged essentially at all. It's actually quite remarkable when you think about it. It's actually quite remarkable that in this country, the incomes of only the richest 20% have gone up, 80% have not budged. So what I'd like to think about is that I've actually made the case that assets and stressors are the key determinant of health and the opportunity for flourishing. But I'm also telling you that the accumulation of assets has been restricted to the wealthiest 20% of the population. And that mirrors directly health. By the way, this is a paper which is published in JAMA looking at richest 20%, poorest 20%. And what you see here is richest 20% have about 1/2 to three times less CHF, angina, heart attack, stroke. Worse yet, that gap is widening over the past 30 years, richest 20% versus the poorest 80%. And that gap is bigger now than it was even 20 years ago. Look at the CHF. This is richest 20%, poorest 80%. There was a gap 20 years ago, much bigger gap now. Little gap 20 years ago, bigger gap now. Little gap 20 years ago, much bigger gap now. So in a society where we are dependent on the asset stressor mix to determine health to create opportunity for flourishing, the gap between the haves and have-nots, which I would argue becomes health haves and flourishing haves versus flourishing have-nots, is widening over time. And that is, by the way, inextricable from race. I just don't think you can have this conversation without talking about race. On the left, I'm showing you income. On the right, I'm showing you wealth. You see the income gap is about 2 to 1 white to black families. You see the wealth gap, it's about 10 to 1 white to black families. This was the cover of Time magazine in 2015, where 2015 Time magazine was saying what has changed and what hasn't compared to 1968. This is, of course, the New York Times just this year, talking about the civil unrest that really stems from, I mean, this civil unrest, of course, came because of the murder of unarmed black men and women, but fundamentally, it reflects deep-seated structural forces that have created haves and have-nots, which become health haves and have-nots, flourishing have and flourishing have-nots, groups of people marked here by color, as well as by socioeconomic status, who have the opportunity to flourish and those who do not. In the time of COVID, Black Americans have died 2 to 2.5 times more than have white Americans. And all of that, of course, goes back centuries. There's a map of slavery, from 1860, where we have had centuries of disenfranchisement of particular groups in this country, marked largely by color, by skin color, and by socioeconomic disadvantage. And I actually think that that underlies, that falls very much within the definition of what I was asked to speak about, foundational thoughts as we're thinking about health and thinking about flourishing. That map of slavery, by the way, maps on directly, for example, with a map of the stroke belt in the United States today. 150 years later, the stroke belt looks exactly like the density of slavery was 150 years ago. I just want to make one last point on this, in that we've talked quite a bit about COVID and the racial gap in COVID. I do want to point out, this from paper just came out in PNAS, that in this analysis, yes, there's an enormous black-white gap in COVID, but the black-white gap actually pales in comparison with the black-white gap that exists in pre-COVID times and in quote-unquote normal times, which is about, in order for us to adjust mortality between black and white differences, about an extra 400,000 deaths. To adjust life expectancy, it's almost 1 million deaths between black and white that are disproportionately lost. Just to give you a sense of the magnitude of these gaps, which is why I actually think that that has to be part of the conversation when we think about health and flourishing over the life course. So I'm going to wrap up. Looking at my time running out, so I'm going to talk about investing in health and flourishing for a second. Are we investing in the right way in health and flourishing? Well, it depends how you look at it. This is a map. Most local governments spend more on policing than they do on health. I would ask us whether that's the kind of world that we actually choose and want to live in. We have invested quite a bit in health. This is the rise in digital therapeutics markets worldwide, projected all the way to 2025. And a lot of our investment has been fueled by thinking about health as individually driven, as I showed you earlier, by that notion of our happiness and our flourishing as being fundamentally having a locus of control within the individual. And as a result, our investment should only be in the individual, which is, of course, flawed based on this foundational perspective I'm giving. This gives a sense of this. The determinants of health are on the left. What we spend is on the right. Medicine determines 10 to 20% of health. Physical environment, healthy behavior, socioeconomic factors are everything else. But we spend 90% of our investment is specifically on medicine targeted at the individual. When we know that early childhood education has about a 5-to-1 ratio benefit to cost because we reduce crime rate, child maltreatment, teen pregnancy. We know that the earned income tax credit decreases infant mortality, and on and on. So to close, I actually do not think that I don't think we can really think comprehensively of health and flourishing without taking it beyond the individual and thinking of it as a public good. That if health is a state of physical and mental well-being, and flourishing is the potential for people to achieve their potential, that should be something that we want for all of us, and that should be something that we invest in as a public good. This ultimately has echoes to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everybody has a right to standard of living adequately for health and well-being, themselves and their family. And that reflects what a public good should be. It's something that does not lend itself to market production, purchase, and sale. Must be provided for everyone, be provided for anyone, and should be paid for collectively if it cannot be had by all. That, of course, is exactly what we do not do with health and flourishing in this country. And I'm here to make a case that's something that we should do with health and flourishing in this country. And for those of you who are perhaps a bit more cynical than I am, which is fair enough, who say, well, that's unreasonable. How can you say that? You know, we do this all the time. We do this in the craziest of ways. This is Manhattan, where I live before I moved to Boston. You know, this is one of the most expensive real estate markets in the world. And right in the middle of Manhattan, there's a very large piece of public good, which is a large, beautiful park, Central Park. And of course, we could treat Central Park differently. We could just divvy it up. We could divvy it up, and every resident of Manhattan gets a little teeny tiny bit of Central Park. No, we don't do that because it's ridiculous. It's similarly ridiculous not to recognize that our collective health and flourishing would benefit if we saw it as a public good. Public health, which is my discipline and where this is being hosted, I think plays a key role here, because public health is what we as a society do collectively to assure the conditions for people to be healthy. And my talk is all about the conditions for people to be healthy and for people to flourish. Public health ultimately is about promoting the values that allow us to act and the knowledge that allow us to act. And this is something which I've published, which is we can think of what we do all along this axis. Do we have enough knowledge? Are our values aligned? We know how to treat polio, and our values align with polio. We don't have enough knowledge about guns, and our values are very muddled about guns. When I did the slide, I did it with, this was before COVID, but we have values that actually want us to control certain outbreaks, but we don't necessarily have knowledge. And there are things for which we have knowledge, like, for example, safe injection facilities, but our values don't align. Our job in public health is to create the knowledge and to shift the values to align. And I would argue that that's actually what we need to do around health and flourishing. So I'll stop there. I'll stop there with my final slide, which is about sports, because somebody told me once it's always good to end on sports. So I'll end with the only sport I care about, which is soccer, and with the world's best soccer team, which is the US Women's National Soccer Team, won the World Cup twice in a row. And the reason I'm talking about soccer is because I want to explain how the game works very quickly. 11 people on one side, 11 on the other side. They have to score into the net on the other team. If nobody scores on you, you'll never lose. Now, so the way soccer works, there are these 10 women wearing white. They can only use their feet, hands, football. The woman wearing black, her name's Alyssa Nair. She can use her whole body. In a theoretical sense, if you have the world's best goalkeeper, she'll never let a ball in, you'll never lose, right? So if you don't play soccer, and I'm sorry for you if you don't, you say, well, if I just invest in the best goalkeeper ever, I'm always going to win, because I don't want to bother with the other 10. I can just invest in one. But when you see a soccer game, you see what the goalkeeper does. And what she's doing the whole game is yelling at her fellow players. And you know what she's yelling at them? Keep the ball away from me. Because she knows, no matter how good she is, the ball comes at her fast enough, she's going to let a ball in. So the notion that we can invest in the world's best possible goalkeeper and always win is nice, but it's theoretical. It's not reality. In reality, we need the other 10 players to win. And the other 10 players are the assets and stressors that we acquire over our life course. They are violence and gender equity and livable wages and sustainable housing and a clean environment. Those are what the other 10 players are. And that fundamentally is what creates the foundations for health and flourishing over the life course. That's it. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Galea, for that incredible sort of foundation setting talk. That was really terrific. I think it's unusual for people to think about well-being and flourishing from the context of the social environment and social conditions. It is so often more thought of as an individually oriented goal and as achievable by individual ends. So I think it's really important to set it up as a function of social conditions and to help people see why that's the case, which you've done just really eloquently. So thank you. I also wanted to just welcome Dean Michelle Williams from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, who's joined us for the duration of the panel going forward. So we're delighted to have her here as well. And I just wanted to take a few minutes before we get into the panel discussion to sort of take off a little bit on some of the comments that Dr. Galea made and speak to the notion of positive health and functioning and assets and stressors in the way that you talked about. And one of the comments we've heard frequently, well before COVID, but certainly in the time of COVID, has been this question of why should we look at assets? Why should we talk about positive health in a time when people are really truly suffering? And what we really should be doing is trying to alleviate suffering. And one of the, we've been thinking hard about this actually at the center, because of course we all have some of the same issue, which is we should, fix the problems as quickly and as effectively as possible. But one of the ideas that we've been exploring at the center and come to believe very strongly is that if you only ever focus on what happens when things go wrong, it is very hard to figure out how to make them go right. And I think, Dr. Galea, that you expressed this so eloquently when you said it's an interplay between assets and stressors. And often in public health, and certainly in medicine, we spend a lot of our time looking at the stressors or the deficits or the risks and the things that are causing deterioration and causing things to fail or go badly. And while that is incredibly important, and we would never say that we shouldn't pay attention to that, what we have argued is that there has been a general failure to look at assets. What are these assets that help people maintain health over time? And that the fact that something bad isn't present doesn't necessarily mean that you have a strength or that you have a resource. So it can sometimes be that. It can sometimes be that these are two sides of the same coin, but it can also be that, having a really positive set of social relationships is quite different than just having some social relationships that may not be super positive, and neither are they necessarily toxic, right? So one of the arguments we've been making at the center is that we should really look carefully at what are assets, what are things that truly protect health, and relatedly, who gets to have these assets? And do these assets work similarly across different populations, right? So there's lots of thinking about, well, there could be health disparities because assets work differently in different groups, right? So positive social relationships may be more beneficial in one group for a variety of reasons than in another group. Or it's possible that not all groups have the same opportunity to attain these assets, but that once assets are attained, they work very similarly to influence health and health-related outcomes and flourishing and positive functioning and so forth. And empirical data ultimately will answer these questions. And that is really what we hope the symposium will shed light on, is some of the work that's going on in this area and where we think the area should continue to go. And the other reason that we have argued for an asset-based focus in addition to understanding risks and deficits is that you can't always fix all the problems, as we all know, much as we would really like to. But it may be that certain strengths and resources can help build compensatory pathways or alternative routes to get to a healthier outcome. So even if you can't remove all the bads, it may be that you can actually add sort of resources that will enable people to get to a better outcome or will disrupt the effects of exposure to toxic problems and so forth. So, and there's actually a theory about this, it's called reserve capacity theory. And the idea is that if you have a buildup of more assets, then even when things go bad or things are difficult, you have more assets to draw on, more resources. So it takes longer for things to deteriorate and things to go wrong, and you still have a better chance of achieving health and flourishing and so forth. And that's where we think a lot of the research is going to be incredibly informative and richly rewarding by allowing us to get to this interplay of stressors and assets that Dr. Galea spoke so eloquently about, and to understand not only which assets matter, when they matter, and for whom they matter, but how they are distributed throughout the population, and what are the conditions that make it more or less likely that more or fewer people will be able to attain those assets. So we're really excited to have this discussion today. It's clearly an ongoing discussion that will not, sort of get settled just in today's panel and keynote, but we're hoping that it will be provocative and that people will go home and think more about it, and maybe ways to kind of join the discussion. So I think what I'd like to do now, in the interest of time, is introduce our other panelists who will be joining us to share some of their thoughts on some of these assets that we think are important. And I'm going to introduce both of them. They'll each give some remarks for about 10 to 15 minutes. What I will say is, if people have questions that are sort of clarifying on the particular talk, if you want to put them in the chat box, we can put them to our speakers. But then we'll hold sort of most of the bigger picture questions for when the panel speakers are finished. And then we have about 20 minutes for Q&A with hopefully a robust discussion with the audience and the panelists and so forth. So that's the plan. You can put your questions in the chat box, as I said, and I will try to, pick them up and put them to our panelists. So for now, what I'd like to do is introduce Dr. Tara Gruenewald, who is our next speaker. And a special welcome to Tara, because she's on our scientific advisory board for the center, and we have appreciated her help in guiding some of the work of the center as well. She is associate professor and chair of psychology at the Green College of Health and Behavioral Sciences at Chapman University. She's a social and health psychologist who also has training in public health and gerontology. So like so many of us in public health, has many disciplines in her bucket. Her research focuses on the social and psychological factors that shape cognitive and physical functioning, physiology, mental and physical health across the life course. And a major current focus is looking at the role of generativity in shaping health and functioning later in life. She is a fellow at the Gerontological Society of America. She served as a network associate at the MacArthur Foundation Network on Socioeconomic Status and Health, and was elected to the Leadership Council of the American Psychosomatic Society. So she wears many hats and has served in many leadership positions, and we're most excited to hear about her research today. So Dr. Gruenewald, if you would please.
Yes, thank you, Laura, for that kind introduction. And I really want to thank the symposium organizers for inviting me to be a part of today's discussion. I was told I could have a few minutes to share my thoughts before we launch into that discussion, so that's what I'd like to do. Dr. Galea provided, I thought, a very comprehensive and thoughtful overview of the many social assets that might affect our health across the life course. So I'm really looking forward to engaging in some of the discussion around the provocative questions that were raised by his presentation, and also the thoughts that Laura just shared. But I thought what I'd like to do first is just situate any perspectives I might share in the context of a couple of the social assets that have really caught my research attention over the last couple of decades. And that is looking at both the benefits of getting and giving support and a sense of connection to others. I just want to make sure everyone can see my slides. Yes, great. It wouldn't be the first time I gave a talk where only I could see them. We know that over a century's worth of research points to the importance of social connectedness and some of the supportive functions that flow from our social connections for our health and well-being. So here on the slide is just a figure recreated with data from a meta-analysis by Holt-Lundstad and colleagues. And what it shows is the reductions in mortality risk as a function of various risk and protective factors. And larger values represent a greater risk in mortality reduction. And really the key takeaway here is that being in more integrated social networks and having higher levels of social support is associated with reductions in the risk of mortality that rival and often exceed many of the factors that we spend both our public health and our health service dollars on, things like smoking cessation or encouraging folks to get a flu vaccine, keeping folks physically active and helping them maintain a lean body weight. And we know from lots of other meta-analytic studies and comprehensive reviews that having more integrated networks, having more support from our social connections, being more socially engaged also confers benefits for a wide array of other health conditions, things like the progression of cancer and cardiovascular disease, the risk of incident heart disease or stroke, as well as cognitive impairment and dementia, and also benefits for our mental health, including conditions like depression. And a lot of my work has focused on links between these social factors and these various health outcomes, and in particular, trying to understand the psychobiological pathways that might explain how it is that these facets of our social world sort of get under our skin to affect our health. But about a decade ago, it occurred to me that we were missing one really important part of this puzzle, and that is what I like to call the other side of the coin, really thinking about the benefits of giving support and being a source of connection for others. And I'm just going to highlight some general sort of things that we've learned from this literature. One of the things, we haven't quite amassed a decade of research yet, but we know from what we have done, and much of this work that I've done has been under the general umbrella of generativity. And what that broadly means is generativity is care and concern that we direct towards others with the intention of trying to enhance others' well-being. So what we know from this literature, from my lab and others around the country, is that folks who feel more generative, who feel like they make important contributions to others, and who engage in a greater level of generative activity, things like volunteer work and providing support to others, those activities and those perceptions are much like we see for the literature on receiving support from others, associated with important health and well-being outcomes, things like greater longevity, lower risk of the onset of physical disability impairments, more positive trajectories of cognitive function as we age, and better mental health. And so one of the reasons that I think it's important to look at this is because we have spent really a century of our research attention trying to understand how the things that we get from others might affect our health. And what this body of work is showing is that our contributions and the things we give to others may be just as important for our health and well-being. Now, in our efforts to try to understand how it is that feeling and being generative might be linked to better health and well-being, we've discovered that there are a number of cognitions and emotions that might flow from feeling and being generative that might help to explain the better health outcomes in the more generative. And for example, we've used survey methods, experience sampling methods, even experimental methods where we try to alter people's perceptions of how generative they feel. And what we've learned from this body of work is that when people feel more generative and when they engage in generative activity, they actually feel more connected to other individuals. They have a greater sense of belongingness. They have an enhanced sense of their worth, and they feel like life is more meaningful and that they have a greater sense of purpose in life. We also know that feeling and being generative is linked with greater positive affect in general, and we often refer to this as sort of the warm glow of giving. Now, we're a ways away from showing that these cognitions and emotions that flow from feeling and being generative directly mediate some of the health correlates that we've seen of generativity. But I think one thing that's important to point out is that these cognitions and emotions have been found to affect health and well-being in their own right. Some of the work done by folks that run this wonderful center here at Harvard have shown connections between these thoughts and emotions, and greater longevity and better health outcomes. But I also think that these are important goods in their own right. So Dr. Galea was talking about flourishing and the variations in flourishing as a function of many different social assets. And so feeling like we belong, feeling like we have worth and value, feeling like our lives are meaningful and purposeful are important goods that we should try to figure out how we might enhance and facilitate the achievement of just in their own right. So this is one of the reasons why I'm excited to have folks think about the benefits of generative activity and how we might intervene to facilitate that activity and perception in individuals' lives. One of the other things that I think are really important to think about in this line of research is thinking about the life course characteristics of generativity and generative engagement. So generativity is thought to attain prominence in midlife and beyond, and our data and those of others really do support that generativity does take on greater significance in terms of individual self-concepts and their level of engagement in activities designed to enhance the well-being of others. But we know that desires to be generative and to engage in generative activity are present across the adult life course, and even before that in childhood and adolescence. So I really want to call on us to think about some of the life course characteristics of generativity and some of the benefits that might occur for our health and well-being of generative engagement, and whether that might vary across the life course. For those who work in the youth phase of the life course, I don't. As Laura pointed out, much of my work really focuses on middle and older adulthood and how social factors are linked to health and well-being in those phases of the life course. But my fellow colleagues who try to think about flourishing and well-being earlier in the life course in youth know that some of the core components of many youth development programs are really focused on contribution and connection. So very early on, trying to have people think about generative engagement and the benefits of generative engagement for their own personal development. I should also point out that we are engaged in a national COVID study where we're trying to understand the how pro-social behaviors specifically around the COVID-19 epidemic might affect individuals' health and well-being. And one of the things that we're seeing is that COVID-specific generativity, so things we do to try to help others around the pandemic, actually increases with decreasing age. So the young are actually engaging in more COVID-specific generativity, at least in our national sample. But what's interesting is that engagement in COVID-specific generativity has benefits for positive coping and well-being independent of age. So we are seeing the benefits of that across the life course. So I think one thing I just want us to think about is how engagement in generative activity and its connections with mental and physical well-being might vary or might not across the life course. Another thing that I think people always ask when I present this work is whether there are limits to generativity. And that really is the question of, is generative engagement always beneficial for us, or are there contexts or characteristics around contributing to others that may put some limits on some of the benefits that we see? So what we know from this literature is that volitional generative activity, that is activity where you seek out ways to sort of benefit and improve the lives of others, such as we often see in volunteering, seems to be more consistently linked to positive health and well-being outcomes. But there are forms of giving that aren't as volitional in nature. And a good example is caregiving for a relative that might have a significant health impairment, for example. That might be a situation or a context in which giving might not only yield benefits, but might actually be harmful, something we often observe in the caregiving literature. One thing I will point out about that, though, is that we did a study where we looked at depressed caregivers, and sort of tried to understand some of the positive benefits of caregiving. And what we found is that caregivers who did report greater perceptions of generativity from the care that they provided, they actually had lower days of work cut back as a result of their sort of depressive symptoms as compared to their counterparts who felt less generative in their activity. So really thinking about some of the moderating conditions in which giving might actually yield some benefits is, I think, a really important place for us to think about. And I'll end with this, just in challenging us as we were thinking about Dr. Galea's very thoughtful presentation about the many different social factors that affect our health and well-being, and challenging us to think about the ways in which giving of ourselves and giving of others and engaging people in meaningful activity in which they feel like they're making a difference in the lives of others might actually yield some benefits, not only for the individuals who are giving, but also more broadly for the communities in which these folks live. Because I think we would all agree that we are experiencing some social fractures in our world, and that there's a number of opportunities in which we might think about ways of encouraging generative activity in others, and trying to think about that as both an individual and a public health intervention. So I really look forward to discussing some of the questions that were raised by Dr. Galea's presentation and some of the insights Laura provided, and that Claudia will as well. And looking forward to discussing some of these possibilities with you. So thank you for listening.
That's terrific. Thank you so much, Dr. Gruenewald. That was great, and lots of food for thought. I don't see any sort of immediate questions in the chat box for this, although some questions are coming in for the larger discussion. So I think we'll go ahead and move on to Dr. Trudel-Fitzgerald's talk. I'll just give a brief introduction in the interest of time. She joined the Lee Kum-Shung Center for Health and Happiness as a research scientist in 2018, which we were very excited about. She is a clinical psychologist trained in cognitive behavioral therapy who has experience in treating clinical disorders. Her research projects, they target the role of positive and negative emotions in the maintenance and decline of physical health, as well as longevity. She's been the recipient of an Early Career Best Presentation Award in the 2017 World Congress on Positive Psychology. She's a member of the program committee for the American Psychosomatic Society, and she's been extremely involved with the center since its inception. And took a lead role in the measurement project, along with the creation of an online repository of psychological well-being measures, which is on our website. We encourage you to take a look at it. But for now, we're delighted to have her. So I'll hand it off to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. I'll just pull up my slides. Great. So thank you for this lovely introduction. Also, I want to briefly say that it's quite an honor to be speaking along those great speakers and scholars talking about a social environment. I think it's a really nice, virtual at least, social environment today. So thank you for having me. I'll be presenting a couple of results on how social connections can be actually really important for healthy aging and longevity today. So over the past few years, the research on social determinants of health has been shifting. As you probably know, earlier work has generally endorsed a more traditional risk-focused perspective. So thinking about how social isolation, for example, could be related to chronic disease risk and mortality over time. But if we think about health as a continuum, then we need to move beyond those negative health outcomes. And in fact, this has led to an emerging positive health framework, thinking more about how we can improve healthy aging and lifespan, for instance. And one of those social determinants that could be key are social connections. Social connections are important. They are especially important at the time of COVID-19. So if we want to flatten the curve, not only we need to distance ourselves, but also we may end up seeing our friends and family less frequently and more relying on technological platforms rather than in person. And those different changes in our social relationship, of course, could impact our daily functioning, but it's unclear for now to what extent that could impact our physical health down the road. So it's really a critical time to better understand how social relationships and connections could be associated with health, healthy aging, and longevity. When we think about social connections, there are different ways of characterizing them. First, we can think about the structure. So that would be the social network. For example, one person can be fairly isolated, while another can be more integrated. These ties can be closer to the individual or weaker and further away. Another way of thinking about social connections is about the function of those relationships. So we're talking about social support in that phase. So some of these relationships can provide emotional support, for example, while others can provide informational or financial support. And lastly, when we talk about social connections, we also talk about their quality. We have relationships that are positive, nourishing, whereas others can be more stressful and put some strain on the individuals. And among all of these different ways of characterizing social connections, the social network has been the strongest predictor of physical health. And the way we can assess social networks, oftentimes in epidemiological cohorts, we've been using the Berkman-Symes Social Network Index. So that's a self-reported scale that captures 4 different components. The first one is marital status. Second one is the number of contacts with close friends and relatives. And then the scale will also capture the extent to which individuals will participate in religious activities and in other group activities. And we've been using, my colleague and I, this self-reported measure in the Nurses Health Study cohort recently to look at its relationship with lifespan. And we found that women were compared to women who were highly socially isolated, those who were moderately isolated, moderately integrated, and highly socially integrated were all having longer lifespan over the course of the study. So you can see here in model 1, this is a model that is adjusted for demographic information, a really nice linear relationship. So the greater the social integration was, longer lifespan women had. When we further adjusted for health conditions such as hypertension, cancer, or stroke in model 2, you can see that these associations were really robust. Then when we further adjusted for health behaviors, these associations were substantially attenuated, although they were still all statistically significant. And actually, that's not really surprising because these behavioral factors, such as smoking, are often hypothesized as being a mediator between social integration and positive health outcomes, such as lifespan. And I'll get back to this idea of pathways a little bit later. We also looked at whether social integration was associated with the likelihood of reaching exceptional longevity. And based on prior work, we define exceptional longevity as surviving to the age of 85 years old. That's a cut point that is often used because it goes beyond the average life expectancy, but at the same time, it's not too rare to be studied. And in this study, we found that compared to women who were highly socially isolated, all the other levels of social integration were associated with greater likelihood of reaching exceptional longevity. And again, when we further adjusted for health conditions in addition to demographic information, the associations were really robust in a linear fashion with the likelihood of surviving to 85 years old. As we could expect, further adjusting for the behavioral factors or suspect for potential pathways did attenuate some of the association, but the 2 top levels of social integration remained statistically associated with being an exceptional ager. So when we think about factors that could drive longevity, we're talking about lifespan, and that combines together the normal healthy aging phase with the phase that encompasses the age-related diseases beginning before the end of life. But what if we go from lifespan to health span, which is the length of time the person is healthy? The reason we would be interested in that is that we would ideally try to lengthen that period. So we would have a normal healthy aging phase that is longer and then try to compress the age-related disease phase before the end of life. And one way to understand what are the factors that are driving this potentially longer healthy phase would be to look at healthy aging as an outcome. And oftentimes in the literature, that would be a composite score, including people who are aging without any chronic condition, without cognitive impairment, and with intact physical function. And recently, some of our colleagues at Harvard School of Public Health have looked at whether social integration specifically was associated with healthy aging using data from the Nurses' Health Study cohort. And they found a pretty robust association between greater levels of social integration and the likelihood of healthy aging over the course of the study. Even in their fully adjusted model, where they took into account demographic information, health condition, and potential behavioral pathways, there was still a significant association for the top 2 levels of social integration. So at this point, probably some of you are wondering whether the relationship of social integration with health is equally distributed. In fact, the Nurses' Health Study is fairly homogeneous in terms of gathering mainly white individuals. So I'd like to present briefly a great study where the investigator looked at the mortality risk based on social indicator using data from the National Health Interview Survey. And in this study, they found first among white individuals that the higher the level of social integration was, the more reduced was the risk of mortality over time. So as we could expect, a really nice linear relationship among white individuals. Among Hispanic one, they also found that all levels of social integration were associated with a reduced risk of mortality over time. However, the pattern was slightly different among Blacks. More specifically, only the highest level of social integration was associated with a reduced risk of mortality over time, up to minus 33%. But as you can see, the 2 intermediate levels of social integration were not statistically associated. So that would suggest that for Black individuals, they would need to reach a certain threshold in their social integration to see the benefit on mortality risk. We were curious whether this pattern could be seen in another data set of Black individuals. So we're currently conducting these analyses using data from the Jackson Heart Study. And surprisingly, we found a slightly different pattern. So again, this linear association between social integration and mortality risk was obtained. So more specifically on your left side, the more people were highly socially isolated, the greater risk of mortality we obtained, which is as we could expect. But also gradually, as we were moving towards more socially integrated individuals, the risk of mortality was reduced up to minus 23%. And what's noteworthy about these analyses is that not only we adjusted for demographic information, health conditions, health behaviors, but also depressive symptoms, indicating that these associations would exist over and above or independently of any signs of psychological distress. So the next question after seeing all these beautiful results is, of course, what are the pathways relating social integration and longevity? Or in other words, what are the mechanisms that could explain this association? I've been talking a little bit earlier about the healthier lifestyle. However, in our study and most of the work out there, when scholars do adjust for potential behavioral pathways, the association between social integration and longevity remains, which suggests that there might be other potential pathways that are likely at play. One of them could be positive psychological functioning. So for example, people who are more socially integrated could be more likely to be optimistic or have a stronger sense of purpose in life. They might also be better equipped to cope with stressful life events that could occur. And in turn, that could contribute to a better and longer life. Another pathway that is possible is more favorable biological processes. So we can think that higher level of social integration would be associated with lower levels of inflammation, but also perhaps better immune function. And as a result, we know that these biological processes are associated with longevity. There are future directions for this field, of course, especially if we think of healthy aging, longevity, and those positive health outcomes. First, it will be important to look at various populations. I've been mentioning the potential differences between racial groups, but also looking at sexual minorities, for example, or whether we see these associations across different levels of employment, especially if we think that the workplace could be a good environment to develop those weaker and stronger ties. A second future avenue could be to look at whether social integration has some synergistic effect with other markers that are positive of the social environment. So for instance, if we have better social integration and most of these associations, these relationships are nurturing, does it have any multiplicative impact on predicting healthy aging and longevity over time? And lastly, the interaction between social integration and all the different more detrimental indicator of the social environment is an important avenue. So someone could have a really large network and be highly socially integrated. However, these relationships can be stressful, or that person can really feel lonely nonetheless. And to what extent that plays out differently in terms of healthy aging or longevity, we don't know yet. And I want to conclude this talk by encouraging all of us to be mindful, but also creative in how we can maintain the current relationships that we have and nurture them. Of course, with COVID-19, that's kind of a challenge. We have this recommendation of being socially distant, but actually when we think about it, we need to be physically distant, but we don't need to be socially isolated. So let's stay connected for a better health and well-being.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That was wonderful and very timely in the moment of COVID for sure. We had so many interesting, thought-provoking ideas here, and I fear that we will not have enough time to have as much discussion as we would like. But what I'll say is that we do have another symposium coming up and we can have more discussion then. I did have, so people are welcome to pose questions into the chat box. We won't have time for too many. I have one already that I was going to pose. This one is from Tyler Vanderwill. I don't know if you want to turn on your picture, Tyler, but this is specifically for Dr. Galea, although I think others are welcome to weigh in. And he asks, you described flourishing as humans achieving their potential. What is that potential? Should we attempt to discuss or define or even assess it, or just leave it ambiguous? You seem to describe the role of the School of Public Health as one that promotes the means. Should we in public health restrict ourselves to the study and promotion of means, or of what you described as the end as well? That was an easy one.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's an easy question because I was expecting Professor Vanderwill to ask that exact question. And when I was preparing for this talk, I read Professor Vanderwill's writing so that I could actually set up that exact question. Tyler is actually is better qualified to answer that question than I am, but I will attempt a feeble response and then he can add to it. I think the question of whether we define that potential is actually a really intriguing question. And I actually would argue that that's a question at the level of values. Is it acceptable that, given that if we provide me health as a means, as I discussed, in order for me to achieve my potential, but I choose with that health to only sit on the couch all day and watch Netflix, is that an acceptable expression of me achieving my potential? And I actually think that that is a value question. I think it's a value question about whether we as a society are willing to accept people having different expressions of what they do with their capacity for their potential. If one goes down the road that says our value is that we let people do what they will with the means, so to speak, then the school of means to the end doesn't actually dabble that much in what the end would be. If we actually think that we have a role to play in arguing for a particular end expression, then I think we actually could engage in the slightly messy world of helping shape those ends. If you were to ask me where I fall on that spectrum right now, I probably fall somewhere in the middle. I actually think that we in the schools of means sometimes err too much on meddling too much on people's choice of expression of what they do with their potential. But I think at the same time, the answer is not so clear-cut as to say our job is just the means and we should stay out of that mesosphere of value determination. But I actually would really be very interested in what Tyler thinks.
Tyler, would you like to have a comment to that?
Okay. First, thank you, Sandro, for a wonderful and thought-provoking talk and sort of setting the lens and the context so broad. You know, like you, I don't find it an easy question, which is precisely why I posed it. And I do think it is something worth debating within public health. You know, I think my own view tends to be, let's try to cast the net with regard to where we can find consensus on values as broadly as possible, acknowledging that there will be areas where we don't agree. But I think we can probably go beyond just health and say income, which everyone really does care about. But you know, maybe to include things like happiness, like social connection, like finding meaning. And I tend to think these other domains of well-being, of achieving in some sense human potential, have near universal consensus. And it's worthwhile, from my perspective, assessing these things as well, trying to study them empirically and thinking about what our public health interventions do or do not do to promote these other aspects of well-being. But I agree entirely. It does become a lot more messy once we start entering into these conversations of values. I just think the set of values where we can agree on is perhaps broader than what we've thus far come to within public health.
If I may just add one thing to that, Laura, I think this actually has echoes in the current moment, you know, the current COVID moment. And anybody who hasn't read Professor Vanderweel's JAM editorial in June around the difficulty of counting sort of what we should be counting around the time of COVID, what really counts towards us, informing how we make decisions. It's a really terrific piece and everybody should read it. And I think it reflects some of what Tyler was saying. It's a different level because I don't think it's so clear what it is that we value, what are the aspects of human flourishing that we should be prioritizing. And in the COVID moment, we have seen that play out really in a very stark way, that we have made policy decisions broadly on a very, very reductive notion of what it is that we value without actually really thinking carefully about what are the aspects of human expression, human flourishing, human being, human living that we actually want to value and prioritize as a society. So I think this is of more than just an abstract concern. I think it's a really live issue right now.
That's great, thank you. So I think we have time for maybe one more question if anyone else has one. And I don't see anything else in the chat box. I had one question for the panel, anyone who wants to jump in, which is, I think we often don't think of, you know, social support or as generativity as a public health good. I don't know how often it's in the conversation about, you know, factors that public health should be concerned with. So I was curious to hear the panel's thoughts on, you know, how do we evaluate their distribution and who has the capacity to, you know, be socially integrated if that's likely to differ. And if you just have thoughts on, you know, how you make this a public health conversation. That was a hard question.
Well, I'll jump in. I think we make it a public health discussion by showing that it has health benefits. And then we can begin to have a discussion about, as you point out, Laura, who has access to opportunities, you know, to pursue opportunities for connection or generative engagement or whatever the social asset is that we're focusing on. But I also, the reason I bring it into the discussion about public health is because I think, you know, one of the things that we learned probably early on in the health psychology literature, you know, when we were looking at data showing that social support and social connections were linked to heart disease and mortality, is thinking that if only we could, you know, teach people to have more connected relationships or, you know, get more support from others, that will lead to better health outcomes. And some of those early efforts, I would say, weren't failures, but experienced some significant challenges. But you can think about opportunities for interventions around things like generative engagement that draw people into shared activity with a goal that many people can rally around and support, you know, to do things for others, for example. And why I get very excited about the idea of providing opportunities for generative engagement is because I think you can imagine interventions and opportunities in almost every areas of our life and in current society where we are fractured and we're experiencing challenges, whether that's COVID or creating a more equitable society, places where, you know, we might try to deal with racism and disparities around race, ethnicity. I think that there are incredible opportunities, and the fact that engaging in these types of activities and interventions will not only, you know, have benefits for individual health, but then collectively for public health, I think is an important part of trying to figure out our way forward. Those are just my 2 cents.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I do think it's really interesting to think about assets that are both, you know, socially derived and have social benefits, because again, we often tend to think very much at the individual level. So I am regretfully going to say that we probably need to move to our closing comments because there's never enough time on Zoom. But I did want to just briefly introduce Dean Williams, who's going to give our closing remarks. She is the Dean of Faculty at the T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Angela Palouse Professor in Public Health and International Development. She has a joint faculty appointment at the Harvard Chan School and Harvard Kennedy School. She is, of course, an internationally renowned epidemiologist and public health scientist, an award-winning educator and widely recognized academic leader who probably does not need a lot of introduction to this crowd. She's published more than 450 peer-reviewed papers on a whole range of really important public health topics, and recognized for excellence in teaching and education. Too many awards to mention, as well as an elected member of many professional and scholarly associations. And perhaps most importantly, she's been a champion for understanding social determinants in health and really appreciating the value of looking not only at you know, sort of deficits and disease, but also at trying to understand positive health and this other end of the spectrum. So we're really glad she was able to join us for the discussion today, and I'll turn it over to you, Dean Williams.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Thank you for moderating this session so beautifully. And I want to say I feel like I won the lottery this afternoon because I got off of a previous engagement early enough to hear almost all of the presentations, and I'm really grateful. It was really lovely for me to sit and listen to the stellar presentations, and then also the Q&A that just ensued. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to, in addition to thanking Laura, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to today's speakers, Dr. Galea, Dr. Gruenewald, and Dr. Trudel-Fitzgerald. Thank you for sharing your expertise and for those really stimulating and enlightening presentations. As many of you, all of you, I think on this Zoom call know, today is the first day of Beyond Longevity, Achieving Well-Being in a Healthy Aging. And this is a 2-day symposium hosted by the Lee Kum-Shung Center for Health and Happiness. I'm really delighted that you've chosen to join us this afternoon for this enriching program on the social assets that support healthy aging. When we reconvene again in November 10th, speakers will continue to discuss important work on aging from a positive health perspective. And the discussions will include covering our current understanding of the social and environmental factors likely to support healthy aging. It'll include discussions of the roles happiness and positive mental health may play in physical health and longevity. And I'm really excited that it'll also allow for opportunities for sharing ideas for future research agenda and exciting collaborations that I hope will come forth from these kinds of convening. Today's program has highlighted the center's dedication to bringing science to bear on how we can help aging populations achieve longevity with good mental and physical health. This is a goal that is in alignment with WHO's definition, and the center understands that health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and is not merely just the absence of disease or infirmity. So I'm excited that the center's focus and work on identifying strengths and assets will continue to be positioned to help people maintain health and well-being, even in the face of challenging times as we are currently encountering. This symposium advances one of our school's 5 frontier areas, or one of our 5 main areas of research, and that is the frontier on our reimagining aging. To that end, this investment and this symposium contributes to the conversation about how aging individuals and populations that are characterized with demographically unprecedented proportions of aging and elderly individuals can continue to thrive. I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Lee family for their generous donation that funds this crucial work and founded the center. And I'd also want to thank them for their continued active interest and engagement in the center's work, and for their commitment to global happiness as it relates to health, global health, and public health. I'd also like to thank the Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies, the POP Center as we lovingly shorten its name, for co-hosting this event. And in closing, I hope that you all enjoyed this first day of the symposium, and that you are as impressed as I am by the work summarized by our distinguished speakers. When we reconvene again in November 10th, our program will focus on the psychological assets that support healthy aging. And I hope you will join us for that, what I understand and hope will be another scintillating, stimulating, and illuminating presentation for us all to enjoy. With that, I thank you all for your time and for your attention. And again, Laura, thanks for guiding through this amazing session.
Thank you, everybody. Be happy to hear from you if you want to get in touch with us. Thanks again to all the speakers.